Sam.
All right, good afternoon. We are excited again for the sfBIG Lunch and Learn, the continuing evolution of bringing the community together, taking the time out. We truly appreciate all of you joining us. We know it's a fun time. At sfBIG, we are so excited to be able to do this, but we really want to appreciate and say thank you to all of our sponsors, TEEDS, the Trade Desk, who just joined us the other day, Verizon, the one that obviously we're very excited about, Quantcast, and the Wall Street Journal. So we thank all of our sponsors for being a part of us, and we look forward to the different things that we're going to be doing with them this year. One of the things that about Lunch and Learns have been exciting is the fact that we have gotten people to tell us what they're interested in. Probably one of the hottest things right now that's going on in the business is podcasting. And the elements and learnings about podcasting today are going to be brought to you by an amazing panel. I think there's a lot of excitement that a lot of you have expressed. The panel's great. Our moderator is great. Conversation is right. If you got a question, put it in the chat box. Zach will open it up, get all of you involved. I can't think of a better person and a more exciting moderator who is going to lead us in a great conversation than Katie Wilcox from iHeartMedia. And Katie, it is your show. We cannot wait. Let's rock and roll.
All right, let's go. So I'm super excited. I have to tell you, I have had the pleasure of having individual conversations with each of our panelists, and it's an exciting, fun, opinionated, vocal group. I think it's going to be a good afternoon, so I'm glad y'all are joining us. So we're going to have each of the panelists go through and just introduce themselves briefly. I'm Katie Wilcox. I'm the region president for iHeartMedia here in San Francisco, and we've got Jen Sargent from Wondery. We've got Paula Mangin from Boyce, Matty Staudt from Jam Street Media, and Matt Turck from Megaphone. And so before each of them introduce themselves, we're going to do a combo intro and a little bit of an interesting question. So what we want to know is give us a couple lines about yourself, but then also tell us, because we all really want to know, because you're podcast experts, what do you listen to that you admit to on LinkedIn, and what do you listen to that is your guilty pleasure? So we're going to ask you in front of however many people are on this call. Tell us what you listen to that you don't want to admit you listen to. Jen Sargent, why don't we start with you?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Sargent. Thanks for being here today. I'm the COO of Wondery. I've been an executive and entrepreneur in digital media for over 20 years, with roles ranging from M&A at JP Morgan to ad-serving software company DoubleClick, to a number of things in the media space. I ventured into the startup world at the bottom of the recession back in late 2008 and was the CEO and co-founder of a company called HitFix, a consumer entertainment brand focused on movies, TV, pop culture. HitFix was acquired in 2016 by Uproxx, and I became president of Uproxx for a few years before they got acquired by Warner Music in 2018. And at that point, I knew I was ready for the next challenge and wanted to be passionate about the product I was working on. And for me, that was podcasts. And that led me to Wondery. At Wondery, I'm responsible for marketing, business development, distribution, and product. If you're not familiar with us, we're the largest independent podcast publisher in the world. We're known for big shows like The Shrink Next Door, Dr. Death, Imagine Life, and Business Wars. Shows that make listeners feel like they're in the middle of it all. In terms of Katie's question, so my LinkedIn podcast would most definitely be Imagine Life. It is one of the most immersive podcasts I've ever listened to, and they're standalone episodes that are just so much fun. My guilty pleasure is Snacks Daily. It's my form of news every morning, and I just love those guys.
All right, thanks, Jen. Appreciate it. How about Paula?
Hi, and thanks again, too, for everybody for being here. This is the first time I've ever done, I guess probably any of us, a Zoom panel like this. But I'm the founding partner of Boyce Mangin. We're a strategic media planning and buying consultancy, and I've been doing that with my partner, Robert, for 16 years. Prior to that, I worked at BBDO, Chiat Day, in media in San Francisco the entire time, which is also pretty rare. I'm a native, which, yeah, definitely makes me not normal for these parts. And I've, been in the media world for a long time. And I think what has always driven me to this industry is just my passion and love of the media. I'm sort of a junkie, and just a huge consumer of it all. And in particular with podcasts, I think I'm really excited about this panel because I think it's just such one of the most pure, authentic forms of media, and as a body is putting out the best content, I think, that exists right now. And it's one of the few ways that you can really connect with people in a really true way. So I'm a huge fan. And as far as my sort of favorite, I guess LinkedIn worthy podcast would be Pod Save America, which for me, when I'm wearing my Fuck Trump shirt here, you can see Pod Save America saved me from jumping off a bridge, basically, when he won in 2016. And so that has just become a big part of my life. And my guilty pleasure, and I don't feel guilty about it at all, is Bitch Sesh, which is basically the breakdown of The Real Housewives on Bravo. So I laugh out. I'm constantly on, well, before the pandemic was, laughing out loud on Muni to that. And I'm such a Housewives fan. I've even taken field trips to LA to go to Pump and Sir, and have met quite a few of them. So again, I don't feel guilty about it. I'm a huge fan, and that would be me.
Thanks, Paula. We appreciate it. Matt Turck, you want to talk about you and introduce Megaphone briefly?
You bet. I'm Matt Turck. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer and a co-founder of Megaphone. Megaphone is it's a publishing and distribution platform, and we also sell advertising against audience, provide data and measurement for our advertising partners. We're the largest enterprise platform out there. We got great partners like Katie's iHeart, to one of our sponsors, the Wall Street Journal, to Paula's favorite podcast, Pod Save America, and Cadence 13. My favorite podcast is Revisionist History with Malcolm Gladwell. We created it 4.5 years ago. It's now with Pushkin Industries. Season 5 is coming out soon, so stay tuned for that. I rarely go outside my network because there's so much great content out there, you can't listen to it all. But my buddy Frank Wall from Turner recommended I listen to the New York Times Daily podcast last Friday, the 23rd of April. It's called I Forgive You, New York, and it's a New York Times columnist giving an ode to New York City. And whether you hate New York or love New York, it'll bring out emotion in you. Tune into that. And then I don't know if I have a guilty pleasure, but one of our partners, ESPN, I'm an avid sports fan. I'm not a rabid sports fan, but I'm starved for sports right now. And one of our partners, ESPN, came out with this Michael Jordan documentary called The Last Dance. The last 2 Sundays, they've aired 2 episodes each. And podcasts in our network, Locked On NBA, has been doing a recap and a discussion on The Last Dance. My wife and I sit down on Sundays, watch both episodes in a row. And then the following day, I listen to that recap. I can't get enough of it. So I don't know if it's a guilty pleasure, but it's just kind of unique in the COVID times.
Thanks, Matt.
You bet.
Matty, you and I have worked together for a long time, so I'll avoid the temptation to tell people how fabulous you are. I'm gonna let you do it yourself.
Yeah, I'm the best. So I was a radio guy, and I did mornings in New York and Washington, D.C., and then finally at Alice Radio in San Francisco. But I left radio to join a startup team of Stitcher. And that was 13 years ago. And at the time, everybody thought that was a pretty dumb idea. And I did too after a few years because podcasting didn't really take off for a while. I also teach at the Academy of Art University, where I've started a podcast program about 9 years ago. My most recent job was at iHeartMedia. I was the first VP of podcast programming in radio. I was there for a couple of years, helped get, when we did the acquisition of How Stuff Works. And then I jumped ship last year, sorry, Katie, to start my company, Jam Street Media, here in Los Angeles. We focus on podcasts for brands, and I'm sure that's something we'll talk about a little bit later. But we also do show development for entertainers, and we're starting our own network, which is about to launch in about a month. But I love podcasts. So for the podcast that I can talk about, Reply All has been my favorite for years and years and years and years. I love it. I don't have any guilty pleasures because I'm not guilty about any of them, but my wife informed me that maybe I should mention my dad wrote a porno as my guilty pleasure. That's one my wife and I both listen to and enjoy quite a bit. And if you haven't, it's hilarious.
Which one is it?
I'm writing this down.
My dad wrote a porno.
Oh, that's the, I thought you said your dad actually wrote a porno. Got
No,
it.
that's the name of the podcast, but it is about a guy's dad who wrote a porno, and they read it they read parts of it every week. It's awesome.
I love it. That's great. So look, guys, podcasts are growing exponentially. We've seen the latest data that came out from PodTrack that certainly podcasts are really experiencing a big discovery phase right now with people at home with COVID-19. And we've seen such expansion in terms of the content. You know, we see storytelling with This American Life. We see a lot of true crime. Some, obviously, Matty, you had acknowledged some of the broad branded content that's coming out. A lot of topical pop-up, impeachment or corona related, interviews, celebrity, fiction, sci-fi. So why are podcasts so compelling for audiences? And I'd like to direct that to Matty and Jen, because I think you two are probably at the forefront of the content creation. So Matty, we'll start with you this time. What makes podcasts so compelling to listen to?
I think right now, you know, we've seen a lot more podcast listening, and it's been because the times are so scary and people get, you know, overwhelmed. And a podcast is a safe place. They bring comfort and companionship. So when you put on the headphones and you listen to a podcast, it's one of the few times in your day that you're not trying to do 5 things at once. And I think people need that and they want that. It's almost like meditation. And I think that most podcasts deliver 3 things, and I talk about these a lot, the 3 E's. Empathy, education, and entertainment. So, you know, you get all of that in one podcast. You know, you learn something no matter, even when I'm listening to My Dad Wrote a Porno, I'm learning something about the host or something, but that entertainment factor and that empathy. And I can't stress that enough. I just, you know, I see that has become, for a lot of the folks I know, their outlets for, you know, just getting away and having something to listen to that's keeps them company.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I'd add to what Matty said. First, I agree. At a time, you know, when social distancing is causing many of us to feel more isolated than ever, podcasts help create a community. And for the listeners, it gives them a sense of belonging. And that's really important. That's always been important, but particularly for these times, it's incredibly important. The second thing I'll add that's really unique and special about podcasts, besides the fact that they are on demand, is it's one of the few forms of media where you can have those 3 E's that Matty mentioned, but you can multitask while you do it. And so in today's environment where we're gardening, walking our dog, cooking, cleaning the house, you can do all those things while you listen to a podcast, unlike video where you kind of need your eyes on the screen. Before COVID times, commuting was really popular as a place to listen to podcasts. So, you know, for all of those reasons, I think podcasting is quite unique.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you think about, you know, kind of the complementary side of that, which is why are they so compelling for advertisers? A couple of just statistics. We see really high completion rates for listening in podcasts. And we see on the iHeartRadio network around 80 to 90% completion rates, which is really significant. Once people start, they're committed to that content. And while some of the ad units, and we'll get into some more on the ad units, some of the ad units are skippable, we see really low skip rates for the ad units. But Paul, I think you were so early into buying into podcasts. So tell us, why did you get in so early, and what is it that makes podcasts so compelling for a brand or for an advertiser or for an agency?
Right. Well, again, and as you've all said, Jen and Matty, the content is awesome. I mean, just from a quality perspective, it's compelling and people want to listen. And so not only is it, you know, it's just such a immersive experience, but from an advertising perspective, there's no clutter. I mean, that's one of the things that you know, I always say, like, you know, being online, it's like whack-a-mole. You're just trying to get shit off your screen. You know, this is popping out, you know, and I work in advertising. And so it's like, you're upsetting your audience, but with podcasts, you know, you've got, you know, and, you know, whether 1 or 2 sponsors, and a big part of that too, is that in the best case scenario, they're host read. And so there's just it's so personal. And I think that for listeners, it's almost like I've seen studies on this. There's a real positive correlation between the listener and the advertiser, because they see the advertiser as funding or supporting this podcast that they love to listen to. And you just, there's usually such a backlash against advertising or advertisers for interrupting that relationship. And here you're kind of making it happen. So, I mean, for us, those kind of opportunities just don't exist anymore. And so it's a huge bonus. And so from the get-go, I think, and again, my business partner and I, because we're media nerds and we listen and do everything, we just became so enamored, and I think for our clients, and I think we like to think our clients trust us, when there's not a lot of data, but it's like, how can you go wrong? This is great content, let's do this. And so, like I said, yeah, we've been doing this for years. I think the first was with Slate, with the Gab Fest, going back to when before Megaphone, and it was Panoply. So it goes way back. Yeah.
And Matt, you have the benefit of seeing such a large cross section of folks who are buying podcasts. And is there anything you'd add to what Paula said about what makes them so compelling as a medium?
Yeah, I also think whether it is the host read or whether it is a dynamically inserted ad, we at Megaphone feel we got to make that ad sound very in-stream. It has to sound very familiar. It has to be non-disruptive to the medium and for that listener. So I think what advertisers are looking for is something that feels in-stream. Secondly, it is a lean forward medium. You've tuned into the show you want to hear, and you're going to listen to one, sometimes possibly two ads in a row, and you're willing to do that because you're going to go back to the content you want to hear. It's not like you're listening to your favorite song. You get a long, several ads in a row, and you switch to your second favorite station. You're going right back to that show that you have that you're engaged with.
And we're going to get more into the ad units, and we'll talk about that. But because we know that content is the queen, driving really all of the interest in podcasts, we see, one of the things that's interesting about podcasts is that there's no barrier to entry. But because there's no barrier to entry, it means there's a flood of content on the markets. I think it was Matty or Matt, one of you told me there are now 1 million podcasts on, was that Matt? Was that you?
Yeah, Apple Podcasts.
Yeah.
And Spotify now.
Yeah. So a part of the issue is the discovery. At iHeart, we're lucky because we have this giant broadcast footprint. So we take our podcast content and we push it out, do a broadcast, a podcast. That's our solution for discovery in the podcast space. But it's a larger issue for the podcasting industry. So kind of how can we solve the problems of promotion and discovery to make this good content rise to the top? Jen, I thought you had some really compelling kind of thoughts on that. So I'd like to toss this one to you to start.
Yeah, this is definitely one of the big challenges for the industry, and it's getting better and better each year, but it's still a challenge. And I think part of that is the fact that the podcasting industry just isn't quite as developed as other industries like maybe film or TV to have all of those ancillary ways of discovering the content. So if I were to draw an analogy with the film industry, there are film critics who their entire beat is covering movies. There's columns and sections dedicated to it. There's sites dedicated to it. There's Rotten Tomatoes, there's Metacritic, etc. It just gives consumers a lot of different ways to discover the content. In podcast land, we're not quite there yet. I'd say it's very much word of mouth. It's discovery through the platforms, whether it's Spotify, Apple, etc., iHeart, promoting. It's PR. And then as more listeners come to the medium and as more dollars come into the medium, it's attracting bigger talent, which then brings in, more listeners. It's attracting IP to move from one place to the other. So you'll have things like a show of ours, the Bachelor show on television has created a podcast called Bachelor Happy Hour. That helped move TV audiences into podcasting. So you see shifts like that as the whole pie is growing, that's helping aid discovery across the board.
And Jen, I think just to pile onto that, iHeart actually had a panel this morning featuring Disgraceland. And what was interesting was that you look at some of the individual cable shows, and the podcast audiences are now larger than some of these individual cable show audiences. And so I think that really reinforces your point about kind of the value of the IP of these podcast brands and the podcast content. Matty, given that you are in the business of developing content and you're really good at it, and so then it's a function of how do we get this content discovered, talk a little bit about kind of your perspective on the discovery front.
Well, I think that, we still come down to a lot of things that, I tell people when they launch a podcast, which is find people who are talking about your subject and go tell them about it. So Reddit groups, Facebook groups, getting into Twitter chats about things, guesting on other podcasts is still a big way to get people to go onto your podcast, and promos that we will swap out. Like if Wondery ever swapped out with us, which would be awesome. We cross promote our shows together. But here's what I found a lot of it. I wanted to so with Gen Z and millennials, they listen to podcasts that none of us have ever heard of. They find them because this is part of their culture. They all listen to podcasts. And in fact, almost 50% say they don't mind sponsors and they'll pay for podcasts. So they're so into it. So they share a lot. So there's still a lot to be said for that word of mouth kind of spread with podcasts. And it's also a good reason when people start a podcast, I tell them to not start a podcast about whatever you had for breakfast that day. It's, you got to be specific about your content and your genre so that you know who to go market to. But, I've talked to folks who are going to do billboards, and I've seen billboards for podcasts. I think we'll get more mainstream, but, for the guys that don't have that money to spend, you still have to be very guerrilla about it and be very devoted to it. And every day you're a marketer. So that's what I always tell my folks, like every day you're a marketer. I know you're a content creator, but you have to be a marketer every day.
That's kind of the holy grail for these podcast content creators is you've got to be a good writer. You've got to be able to articulate your story well. And then you've got to have this promotion engine that goes back behind it. So I think that, while there are very few barriers to entry, it does help understand why some podcasts take off and why others don't. So let's talk about the ad units, because, ultimately we've got a lot of folks here on our attendees who want to understand what is available in that podcast space. So I think I'd like Matt and Paula to talk about this. You probably got the most hands-on knowledge there. So Paula, why don't you start? You've been really focused on the host read. That's kind of, yeah. So why don't you talk about the ad units and what you're finding most effective in terms of the units?
No, and I think that, and it's funny because to Matt and we've done a lot of work with Megaphone, and I think it's interesting because on the one hand, the reads are great, obviously, because it's the most authentic, it's the most it's real, and kind of goes back to the old days of sponsoring, advertising. And so to have a host, the host that you love, that you're listening to, talk about a brand is it just doesn't get any better than that. It's fantastic. But on the other hand, with groups like Megaphone, and some of the larger networks, what they're able to do, again with this dynamic insertion, is produce reads that can then be micro-targeted and disseminated a million different ways, which is hard to do with obvious post reads because they supersede, they go national in most cases. So I think there's a use for both. And as far as units, there's, and I think it really is dependent on the way the podcast is structured, whether it's mid-roll, pre-roll, post-roll. So I think they all have, either can work. I think it's really kind of on a case-by-case basis. But one of the things too, and I don't want to feel like I'm an advertorial or infomercial for Megaphone, but groups where
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, you can pay me later. I do respect. I put a lot of respect in people that produce content, and they know their audience better than we're ever going to. And so oftentimes they will help us with the scripts or provide their own creative services to figure out, again, based on where we're running, what's going to resonate. What we've done, I would say, and I think when we can, we want it to feel, again, consistent with where we're placing our ads. And this is, and just now I'm stream of conscious, but this was not through Megaphone, but one of our clients is Yogi Tea. And especially for now, it's all about, drinking tea and slowing down and kind of being present. And so with well and good, there's Mind Body Green is that we're working with them and we're doing host read podcasts, but what we're doing is sort of a daily meditation to where during our 30 seconds of mid-roll, it's basically, okay, now we're going to take a 30-second break sort of to meditate. And then you can hear the steeping tea in the background. And so it just conceptually and contextually, it's just a real great fit or a great use of that space or real estate. So I think it's just thinking through, where your audience is, what their mindset is, what the opportunities are, and figure out what's going to feel, I guess, the least disruptive. And that's a bad word because I don't think anything is really disruptive in the podcast structure, but based on the audience and the advertiser, what's going to, I think, feel the most effective.
Paula, I have to say, I'm loving hearing you talk about meditation while rocking that shirt. It's a little bit of a dichotomy.
And then there's that, I know, as the person who's been kicked off Twitter twice anyway.
Matt, Megaphone's done a nice job of kind of getting into this dynamic ad insertion space. And it's interesting to me that dynamic ad insertion is not standard operating procedure yet among many of the big players. And I think that's partly a function of information and scale, lack of information about the audiences and then lack of scale to do that. But why don't you talk a little bit more about the dynamic ad insertion and also, a little bit more about the ad units?
Yeah, so Megaphone grew out of Slate. So I've been involved with podcasting for 10 years, and the foundation of this business has been the host read. It is very effective. It's a ROI measurement tool. The hosts do the read. They drive somebody to the website with the URL, and they use a promo code, and you can measure that. The challenge with that is really more with brand advertisers. It's really difficult to get to scale that way, and you're giving up a lot of responsibility of your brand to the host. They can pronounce your brand incorrectly. They can, there's a lot of things that can go wrong for brand as you try to get to scale. So when we launched Megaphone, we knew dynamic ad insertion was part of the future. We kind of scoured the planet. We found a company called Audiometric in Australia. A couple brothers had created it. We thought it was the best platform out there, so we bought the software. One of the brothers is our CTO because we knew we could build it into what Megaphone is today. So all of our advertising is dynamically inserted, and what we've tried to do is evolve podcasting into the digital age. And allow our partners like iHeart to use those tools to take advantage of targeting audience at scale. I mean, if I were to ask the audience that's listening today, how many are in the market for a new SUV, it's probably a very small portion of it. You can zero in on that audience when you use the data to target audience at scale, and then you can use attribution to measure the results of that. We tend to work with 30 and 60-second units, 30 pre-roll, 30 to 60 mid-roll units. We created a studio, as Paula was referring to, that helps our partners create advertising that's going to feel appropriate for the audience. We use multiple voices to keep them diverse, but few voices to keep it very familiar with the audience. And in many cases, depending on those buys, we can test the ad through our, what we call Sonic, and it's a partnership with Veritonic. We can test the effectiveness of those ads before they even go live to see which ones are going to be most effective. So dynamic ad insertion, the host read is an important part of our business, and it's growing, and it's a good business. Dynamic ad insertion, targeting at scale, using data for measurement is where a majority of this business is going to go because it's digital. 87% of digital advertising is being bought against audience today, whether it's programmatic or whether it's handheld. And that's where we believe, and that's where we know the business is going. You can see year over year, it's the brands that are growing, and it's the dynamic ad insertion that's growing at a more rapid pace.
Yeah, and just to hit on a couple things, so Paula mentioned the fact that the host threads generally are national, and that's because if you've got a host reading the script, it's going to go with the podcast, right? And,
Yep.
and Matty and Jen talked about one of the key things with podcasts is the companionship and the belonging, which is you're tapping into that when you're doing the host thread, but it's a balancing act between that kind of high value as well as then the targetability. And obviously you've got a ton of expertise in this. Is there anything you'd add to this kind of line of conversation?
Sorry, Katie, was that for me?
Yeah. Did you hear me? Oh, I think we lost Jen.
I just lost sound for a second.
She's back.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, I just, so Matt was talking about kind of the ad units and the dynamic ad insertion, and just obviously you've got a ton of experience in this space. So anything that you'd like to add between what Matt and Paula said, assuming that you could hear everything that they said?
Yes, I did hear everything they said. Thank you. No, I agree with both of them. And I do think there's room in the space for both. We can't ignore the fact that podcasting is a digital medium, and more clients are looking for different ways to buy podcasts that are data-driven and across specific segments that they're looking for. At Wondery, we're also trying to accommodate both. Host-read ads are still in high demand, but we have different research and insight partners we work with, such as Nielsen, Podsight, Samba TV, to measure podcast advertising effectiveness. And whether it's through brand lift studies, attribution studies, we consistently see increases across brand metrics, and really strive to just provide advertisers insights on incremental visits, leads, purchases, app installs, whatever those KPIs are that they've outlined for us, to allow them to confidently invest in podcasting.
And we're going to get more into measurement, and I see that as a topic that some of our audience is interested in getting into, is measurement and kind of how do you track back. So we will get into that a little bit more. I want to just stick on this ad insertion component. I know, Paula, you expressed a little bit of concern about the dynamic ad process, and we've also got a comment in the from the audience. This is one of the benefits of host-read ads is that they're implicitly endorsed by the creator. With dynamic insertion, or Megaphone and others allowing screening by creators and not just brands. So a little bit of kind of dissent out there and question about the dynamic ad insertion. So Paula, I'm going to pop to you first, and then we'll go over to you, Matt, to talk about answering the question.
No, and I think, again, I think there's pros and cons, and I think too, but what Jen and Matt said is that with dynamic insertion, it allows you to scale. And I think, and get really hyper targeted and use the data, and which we've done a lot. Like one of our clients is Stanford Children's Health, and so that is a very targeted. It's just the Bay Area. It's only parents of young kids, and so you have to get very narrow. So there's no way. I mean, like a host read sort of situation is just not available to us, and so to be able to use the data and to do that dynamic allows us to even use the medium. So I think, again, it's so much of it is on a case-by-case basis. And I think for me, in a perfect world, I agree. I think the host read does give it that authenticity and the trust, and all of that. And it keeps it very personal. But to Matt's point, I think with the dynamic insertion, it does allow you to treat this as kind of a broader reach vehicle, and it is sort of a, I think I almost feel like, well, every ad vehicle it's all digital now, right? Even TV, you look at OTT, which is blowing up. I mean, that's become the norm too, and I just always hope that we don't lose what made advertising and podcast special to begin with. And so, like, my dream, and Matt, I always think about this, like, God, they're going to figure out a way to shove more advertising into these things, you know, because that's what everybody does. Like, everybody wants to make more money. And I'm like, I'm begging you, like, don't, you know, are you going to see it? I'm waiting, like, oh, now we're going to take 4 sponsors or 8, you know, and then there's going to be less podcasts and more. And so I think that's, you know, and look what it's done to all of our digital experience. You know, the greed has taken over in so many ways and just ruined, you know, I think so much of what we have to deal with whenever you're online. So I think that's my big fear is just it's just getting too much.
Yeah. And Matt, can you talk a little bit about do the hosts have any kind of say about the ads that come in when there's a dynamic ad insertion?
They can opt out if they hear the ad and they don't want the ad in their show. I mean, like as you guys have mentioned, you know, we evolved out of Slate. I'm an ex-time inker. I grew out of the space, you know, that you've got to, we turn away a lot of advertising because we know it's not a good fit for the show. Just as we turn away a lot of shows as they aren't good fits for the advertiser. Brand safety is, you know, critical in our network as well. So the hosts, because they aren't endorsing, are more receptive to different ads. But that was always a challenge. We used to sell show by show contextually, and a lot of the hosts didn't want to do the reads of certain advertisers, and you know, and I'd have to beg them because there was so much money on the table to do the reads, and you couldn't tell the advertiser that. The hosts can't do a read for Lowe's one day and Home Depot the next because it destroys their credibility. So there's a lot of challenges with the host reads. Again, I think they're very important. I think it's an important part of our business. It's the foundation of our business, and that business is going to continue to grow. We can still consider a lot of that beachfront real estate, and our partners sell that direct. Again, we're the ones just trying to, you know, help our digital partners move into the space because we can, and I think you want to talk about this later, but we can do traditional attribution studies in the space. We did the first one 3 years ago.
Yeah, we'll get to that just one sec. I just want to get to one other thing in terms of kind of the advertising inside of podcasts, which is the creative. What do you say inside the podcast? And Matty, you and I both come out of the radio space where you understand that when you've got, you know, what you say matters really the most in terms of, you know, that targeting and so forth. And in terms of the host read, part of the charm of a host read in my mind is when someone mispronounces the brand and they have to recapture it and kind of go back to it a little bit because it's memorable. So I'd like to hear what you have to say, Matty, about just how do brands and advertisers unlock the right tone in terms of what they say in the ad, whether that's host read or whether it's you know, something that's pre-recorded.
So, you know, coming from radio, it's here's the number, here's what we're doing, talk, here's the number, here's what, you know, it's just repetitive. With a podcast ad, it's storytelling. And I always tell my podcasters that you're telling the story about you and the brand, and then at the end, you hit them with the CTA. So that it's not it's not kind of that hectic structure. It feels more loose. And that way, you know, we have hosts that do ads that then get dynamically inserted in all the shows. We you know, all the shows we create, we make sure that there's like seamless places where those will pop in and it doesn't seem like the show even stopped. But they have to be done in a way that fits the tone of the show and the tone of the host. But at the end of the day, it's storytelling about a brand. And that's really what I push to my hosts to do.
Jen, Paula, or Matt, anything you'd add on kind of what to say in the ad units? I think Matt hit on it, which Matty hit on it, which is the storytelling component. And I will say that good audio ads, whether it's in radio or it's in podcasts, fundamentally tell a story because people remember stories. And in that story that they remember, then it gets to the call to action. So I think that's consistent, whether it's host read or whether it's something that's recorded.
I was going to say on the advertising that we work with Paula on for Yogi Tea, it was about Zen meditation, and it kind of took you to a different place. We call them serial ads at Megaphone, but it is to your point and to Matty's point, it is about storytelling. Yeah. I sometimes I sometimes don't like to use the term storytelling because we all use it in this business, and it's but it's hard to get around because it's so important.
Because it's real.
Yeah.
All right, so I want to kind of, we've only got, this time is going so fast, and so we've got maybe 6 minutes or so until we're going to turn it over to more questions from the audience. So I do see a few questions coming up in our chat, but I'll just reinforce, if you've got a question or a topic that you'd like us to hit, please put it into the chat and we'll be sure and get to it. But there's a lot of conversation about how do you know that a podcast is working? So it's kind of a two-part question. The first part is about analytics and tools. So Jen, maybe you can talk about kind of what are the tools for learning about what's happening. And then Paula, I'd like for you to talk a little bit about how do you actually tie it back to the advertiser KPI, because we know that sometimes the tools are directional, and then there's this KPI, which is ultimately, in the case of Yogi Tea, did Yogi Tea move off the shelves, or was there increased brand awareness around that product and so forth? So, but Jen, I think Wondery's got a lot of tools that you're using to do the measurement and analytics. So could you just talk about what tools are available and what can be learned from those tools inside of podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started to mention those before. We work with partners like Pod Sites, like Samba TV, like Nielsen, to track performance of ad campaigns, and it really depends on a case-by-case basis. There's direct response clients, and in those cases, when they're selling a very discrete product or services, a lot of times they're using vanity URLs, they're using promo codes, and they're measuring specific actions on their end that we can leverage to understand the success of the campaign. That part is much more straightforward. For brands not selling a product or service that can be as directly measured, we tend to leverage ad effectiveness studies and brand lift studies to create that attribution back. Another thing, though, that our clients love, which is a little less about moving the product, is the contextual alignment when one of our hits becomes part of the cultural conversation, because it aligns an advertiser with a moment in the zeitgeist. And whether they're advertising on a news podcast and they're around something that's trending, or actually a good example of this is last August we released the Joe Exotic podcast. But then with this consistent buzz from Netflix's Tiger King that launched in March, we saw a significant increase in fans and listenership, discovering and rediscovering the initial Joe Exotic podcast. And so that gave the brands associated with that podcast this ability to be part of the conversation with us, and connect with listeners around something that was buzzing. And that's particularly relevant for baked in ads, but that's something that our clients have really enjoyed. We have about 14 of our podcasts in various stages of TV development, and it's let us really amplify the power of an individual podcast.
And Jen, I think that's a good point. And it's kind of like catching a shooting star, right? When you know that something's going to take off. And what I will say for those kind of in the audience is that there are a couple of folks you can work with to identify that. And it's, but you definitely have to get in on that and understand from your podcast partners what is starting to take off and what kind of that cultural zeitgeist. You can see it starting to brew when you see what that content is. So I think that's a great example. We've got that with iHeart too. Matt, you and I talked a little bit more about some tools. Anything you would add to what Jen said about what tools are available for measurement?
Yeah, well, I think Jen hit the nail on the head. The brand lift studies, which have been around in media for a long time, have I joke and say, for those of you who can't see me, I look like a very young millennial, but I've been in media a while, and it's rare. It's a rarity when I see it. It's a rarity. It's a rarity when I see a brand lift study not work, because every party wants it to work. But what I do see in the podcast space is the lift tends to be better, and you tend to get lift in a lot more areas. So I know the brand lift studies are working, but 3 years ago we introduced attribution to the space with a large insurance partner, and we were able to tag at site start. We were able to tag at request for quote, and we saw 176% lift week 1 to week 4, where we saw 50% lift, which is still strong, but you could see it start to level off. And then we were able to build the frequency capping into the system. So our partners and us, our publishing partners and Megaphone can build frequency capping into plans to make them as effective as possible.
And before we get to you, Paula, I see a question in the chat, which is, do you recommend working with a third party such as Millward Brown for ad effectiveness or brand lift? Do you have your own platforms or version for studies? And I will just say for iHeart, we work with Millward Brown and a variety of other partners, and it kind of depends on what we're working to architect. And what questions we're asking and how big the audience is and so forth. But Matt and Jen, are you aligned with a specific partner or for the brand effectiveness? Maybe Jen, you could take that since you kind of brought that forward to begin with.
We work with a number of partners, and it really depends on if our client has a preference or if they're already conducting something with their broader campaign. But we're pretty flexible, whether it's Nielsen or another partner. We haven't found an attribution or brand lift study that we couldn't implement.
Yeah. Paula, why don't you talk about, so that's, all these tools are great. They're very shiny to the point that Matt made. I have yet to see a brand impact study that hasn't worked. So tie it back though to, at the end of the day, yogi needs to sell tea. And it's great for people to have a great belief about them and to meditate with them, but people need to buy and drink the tea. So at the end of the day, how do you bring that full circle?
Well, no, it's interesting because with yogi, we do, we have weekly calls with them when we go over, analytics and campaign effectiveness and all of that. But that's really been more on the digital social side. With yogi in particular, it's strictly awareness. And so there's really no call to action. It literally is about, and it's probably I'm probably in the minority on this, but where we're just kind of using our judgment, and we love it. We feel, we get a lot of, we've always called it like mother-in-law research, where, their retailers or their friends or, different people in their industry tell them a lot that they've loved. They've loved hearing them on podcasts. And so, and again, with them specifically, because it's an integrated campaign, we're running other media channels than podcasts, but their sales are through the roof. Now, what I love to say, all podcasts, we're in a pandemic and people are drinking a lot of tea, especially during a time like this. So, but I know that, and even with Stanford Children's Health, that's another one where there's a lot of components of that campaign we do measure, but again, for that one, we're strictly using it as an awareness, and we've taken up our partners to do brand lift studies, which have always proven. And again, I sometimes you got to take this with a grain of salt, no offense, but they seem to indicate that they're working. And again, and it's one of those things that you just have to feel in your gut. With one of our clients that we took to podcast kind of in the earlier days was Duckhorn Wine, and that was a client who came to us and they wanted to run radio in a couple of markets and target 2 different audiences. One was for Decoy, which targets kind of more of a millennial, it's kind of an entryway wine, and then the Duckhorn brand, which is expensive. It's like $75 plus a bottle. And so they came to us and they wanted to run radio, and it's like, you can't afford to run radio because they're going to be in a very expensive markets. And so like, what about podcasts? And they were super unfamiliar with the category. And so we put together a plan, and we actually, again, Megaphone. This is really starting to sound creepy, but we worked with Megaphone.
Paula, Jen and I are on the call.
Sounds good to me.
Jen and I are.
Yeah. Sorry, and I know, I this is going to sound terrible, but we also worked with NPR, and we actually used NPR for Duckhorn, and we used Megaphone for Decoy, but blah blah blah. At the end of the day, I'm going to yada that part. Their sales were up, depending on the market, in excess of 30%, and after the podcast ran, and like well over and over exponentially paid for himself. And that was one of the ones that felt better than anything, because we can look at analytics all day, but you know, we're here to help our clients sell their products, or take a certain action. And so that to me was one of the most satisfying. They were so happy, and they've continued to use podcasts in their mix. So,
and ultimately, to your point, if you added up every last click together, you'd have sold far more product than you ever thought was available anyhow. So we know that there's a little bit of noise in all the numbers. So that's great. Hey, I can see the questions in chat, and I think we've hit most of them. Zach or Bessie, are you seeing any additional communication from our audience that they'd like to have addressed? Okay, while we're pulling that together, and I would encourage you, if you've got any final questions, pop them in the chat. While we're waiting for that to happen, I just want to ask one last question to each of our panelists, which is, given the shelter in place, everybody's been asking, oh my gosh, how is this changing media consumption? And it takes on average 66 days for somebody to change a pattern. So, you know, we're going to be into 10 weeks of shelter in place. We're going to be well past that 66 days. So there is a real opportunity for people to start to change their patterns. And we're seeing that probably benefiting podcasts a little bit. But I'm just curious, you pull out your crystal balls right now. What do you think may change as a result of kind of being in the shelter in place? And Matty, I saw that you left us and you joined us again. So we're going to kick it off with you.
Sorry, we had a power outage.
Oh, no.
So I'm running around going, so I think that, you know, we'll see more at-home listening, which we're already seeing. I think that it's increased. Spotify said 50% of people listening on their TVs and at home. So that's a big change. I think when people get back in their cars, they're going to continue to listen more. And I would be remiss if I didn't add this when we were talking about the ad stuff, is that I think we're going to see more brands create podcasts, which is my business. Because it is a way to kind of get out of the clutter and not have a bunch of ads in there, and it's just, you know, built for them. And also, like, internal communications, there's all kinds of things that, like, people are learning now that people like audio, and that you know, they'll be doing more. You know, I think you'll get more memos that are in podcast form and things like that don't require people to be in a meeting or read a big white page on something.
All right, thanks. Matt, why don't you, what do you think?
Yeah, well, you know, we can see a lot because we've got so many downloads in our network. It's difficult to say what we can attribute to COVID and the stay at home and what we can't. Things that I think we can is we've seen the flattening of downloads throughout the day, where you saw spikes in drive time, which makes a lot of sense. We saw we saw news jump 30% in listenership. So those things, I think they make a lot of sense. Sports, we didn't see really fall off. It kind of flattened out, and we see it bump up a little bit last week. And I think a lot had to do with the NFL draft and possibly with The Last Dance and Michael Jordan. We did see a little of the, we saw a couple categories fall off a little bit, but it's, again, difficult to point out that it's the stay at home. I do think more people are discovering podcasts. More people are listening to them on the two-way speaker. We're trying to track that right now, which will be kind of interesting coming out of this. And then finally, I think a lot more advertisers are taking note. So as we come out of this, I think we're going to see more advertisers get involved with podcasting as well.
Yeah. Jen, anything, what do you see in your crystal ball?
Yeah, well, I'll add to some of what Matt said. You know, we saw a shift in time shifting of the listening right away with commutes disrupted. And I think that'll be here to stay as people have discovered all the different times of day they can be listening to podcasts and the activities they can be doing while they're doing so. I think that, I mean, we've definitely seen certain categories really pop during this time, like news, education, personal growth. I'm sure that's not a surprise. What we've also seen is a demand for more communal listening. So families, family-friendly content, parents listening with their kids. And so this idea of not just listening on TV or a home speaker, but also content that really fits that use case coming out. I think We're leaning into family content this year with the launch of a show at the end of June called Imagine Life Family. But I think in general, you're going to see everybody responding to these different trends with broader audiences and broader audience demand, really creating more diverse voices, behind the microphone, and an expansion of the genres within podcasting. Even though we have a lot already in the podcast universe, there are clear areas of white space that I think are going to get filled during this time.
Yeah, we're seeing a big increase just in audio as a whole right now. I think people are craving that companionship, and it goes back to the very opening lines that everyone talked about, which is that companionship and community. Paula, anything to add on for your crystal ball?
I mean, they covered everything. I think the one thing I was going to echo too is the whole communal listening, and just more through the connected home. And his voice, I think we've said it, like that as a format is becoming bigger and bigger, and is becoming just easier to access and more huge. So I think that's going to have a huge positive impact. But yeah, I think to me, that's one of the more interesting parts, is the whole communal listening, and listening to podcasts that everybody can listen to at the same time, because it's always been such a personal, vehicle. And so, I mean, that's kind of interesting to me.
Well, Paula, Matt, Matty, and Jen, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. It's been a really fun, kind of sad it's ending actually, because I've had fun getting ready for this and fun doing this. So it's been great. Really appreciate it on behalf of me personally and sfBIG, and it's been really wonderful getting to know you. So John, any final comments?
Yes, a couple of things. Number one, Katie Wilcox from iHeartMedia. Number one, thank you so much. This was the most engaging time I with you could have gone on. This was going to be our live panel, and you always get concerned moving a live panel to this kind of an event. Y'all rock. We want to thank the panelists. The questions were great. People stayed with us. Katie did a wonderful job engaging all the conversations. I hope all of you enjoyed it as much as I did. But before we leave, we've asked Eric Porres from Meeting Science to take just a moment to kick off, because we're going to start rating our meetings in conjunction with Meeting Science and his partnership with Logitech. So Zach, if you pull up Eric for a quick brief, and then we'll say goodbye. Katie, again, from iHeartMedia, remarkable job. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Eric, Zach, is Eric on?
He's coming on right now.
Okay.
Ooh, exciting. I've been promoted to a panelist, not just an interlocutor.
All right. Tell us about Meeting Science. You got 30 seconds.
30 seconds or less. So Fitbit meets Qualtrics for meetings. My own experience with meetings, and I don't know if you've had this experience as well, working in large organizations, small organizations, is, oh my God, meetings suck. And the data, as opposed to anecdotes, say about 89% of people are unsatisfied with the meetings they attend. And if I looked at my history of meetings and I said to myself, my God, if I'm in one more shitty meeting that I can't raise my hand and do something about, I'm going to lose my mind. And so from there, so that thus began my quest to try and find a way to help companies understand the cost, value, and impact of their meetings. And so that is the essence of what we do at Meeting Science. As an aside, John or I could tell you a story of when a brand study didn't go well. We have a really good example. So from the conversation before, John, I don't know if you want to reveal yourself or who the client was back then, but maybe for a future time we can talk about brand studies.
And the exciting thing for us is we're very excited about this because it partners with Logitech, one of the Bay Area's very innovative companies. We're going to ask you to rate the meeting. This is a kickoff. We love innovation. We love new ideas. Honestly, there was so much information. This is a hot topic. They're now podcasting's at the table. It's at the table, legitimate medium. Katie, I think the things that you brought out were really strong. Please look at the Meeting Science, rate it for us. Let us know what you think. And on behalf of all of us at sfBIG, wonderful job, Bessie and Aaron, again, sourcing content. We've got a tremendous May lined up. We want to thank Verizon Media, Wall Street Journal, Quantcast, Teeds, and our newest partner, Trade Desk, which literally came on this week. To all of you, thank you. Have a kick-ass Thursday and a merry month of May. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Katie. Thanks, San
Thanks,
Francisco.
everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you all.
Thanks, panelists.
Bye.
Bye.